Club, episode 66, and as promised in yesterday's video, I'm going to have a more fun game this week. And before I do that, though, I'd like to give you a little astronomy bit about our motion in the universe. And it's sort of interesting. We don't feel motions, but we're actually moving all the time with respect to all sorts of different objects. So how are we moving right now? Well, since the Earth is rotating, we're moving quite rapidly, actually, spinning around the center of the mass of the Earth. And that motion at our latitude is about 340 meters per second. And that's about the speed of sound. So that's a pretty fast motion with respect to the center of the Earth. But of course we don't feel it because the Earth is moving along with us. It does mean that if you make a clap your hands say that the sound wave, since we're traveling toward the east, the sound wave actually that's traveling toward the west is more or less stationary in space, at least with respect to nearby space. And so that's one way in which we're moving, but the Earth itself is moving. So it moves. The center of mass of the Earth actually first and foremost doesn't orbit the sun, but it's orbiting around something called the Earth-Moon Barycenter, which is the center mass of the Earth and Moon as a system. And that's a point that's actually underneath the surface of the Earth. It's about 1,000 kilometers. Well, it's about 3/4 of the way to the surface of the Earth. So 1,500 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. There's a point that the Earth-Moon system is rotating around. So the Earth rotates just opposite the moon. It's kind of like a big fat skater and a skinny little kid, and they're spinning together in a circle. And of course the big skater doesn't move very much and the little kid whizzes around, the little kid being the moon in this case. And that motion is pretty small, and we're only traveling like 25 meters per second, which would be about the speed that a car travels. A kilometer per second is about 2,200 miles an hour. So a meter per second is about 2.2 miles an hour. So that's why 25 meters per second is about the speed of a car. If you look at the motion of that Earth-Moon system about the sun, that's actually traveling pretty fast. That's about 30 kilometers per second that we're orbiting around the sun. That's about a 10,000th of the speed of light. And 30 kilometers per second is faster than anything I have easy to compare to. It's roughly 3 times the escape velocity of the Earth. Say that the Apollo moon launches were going at the time that they were injected into translunar orbit. So we're moving very fast around the sun, but the sun itself is moving. It's moving with respect to the nearby stars. You can look at the stars and they're all drifting one way and the other, but if you look at an average, the sun on the average is moving relative to that ensemble of the stars that are within a few tens of light years. And we've measured that, and that's only about 13 kilometers per second. So the Earth is actually traveling faster around the sun by about a factor of 3 than the sun is actually moving with respect to the nearby stars. So it sort of means that the motion of the Earth through space is kind of a corkscrew when you superimpose the sun's motion and the faster motion of the Earth around the sun. So we've got the nearby stars that we're tied down to now, but how fast are they moving? Well, they're, of course, all orbiting around the center of the galaxy, around the center of the Milky Way. And the stars that are there, as well as the black hole, that's a massive black hole, that's 3 or 4 million times the sun's mass, that's anchoring the center of the Milky Way. And that's been measured a number of times, our motion with respect to the center of the Milky Way, because it's an important number. It's the Earth's orbital velocity within the galaxy. And it was measured most accurately, actually, by Mark Reed and his collaborators, so half a dozen years ago, using VLBI, which is interesting. Mark is an old fellow grad student of mine at Caltech, and also of interest to the chess club is that he's a chess player. Hasn't played a tournament game in a while, I guess, but he used to play at the Wachusett Chess Club, and was a Class B player there. And using VLBI, Mark found that we're rotating around the galactic center at about 240 kilometers per second. So that's getting to be pretty fast. That's something like 500,000 miles an hour. Fast motion. Even so, it's a long way around the galaxy. The galaxy is big, and it takes about 200 million years to make one orbit around the galaxy, which means we've only orbited the center of the galaxy about 25 times since the solar system was created, since the sun and the planets formed. But by now it's probably not surprising. The Milky Way itself is not stationary. It has a small amount of motion relative to some of the other galaxies nearby, which are called the local group. But if you look at we can look at the motion of the Milky Way plus the other galaxies and see how we're traveling. And you do that by looking at the cosmic microwave background. You can look at this afterglow of the Big Bang that's looks like a 2.7 degree Kelvin black body, if you know what one of those is. And it turns out that if you look in one direction, the temperature's a little warmer. It's a little blue shifted. That is, it looks like we're headed in that direction. The other direction, it's the opposite direction. It's a little cooler, which we interpret as being a redshift. And it's this large dipole signature that shows us that we have some sort of motion relative to the afterglow of the Big Bang. And that's actually pretty fast. That's about 630 kilometers per second that it works out to, that we're actually moving along with the local group of galaxies. And we're headed toward a region called the Great Attractor, where it's thought that there is a lot of mass that is maybe gravitating our local group of galaxies. It's not terribly well understood because it happens to be somewhat obscured by our own galaxy. It's near the galactic plane. But it's a hot topic of research, and we're trying to find out more about this super group of galaxies that we belong to and what those motions are. So, hope you enjoyed traveling around the universe a little, and now we'll get to the chess game. So here's the game that I played against Geoff this week. And it started out I had white, Geoff had black, and I played e4, and he responded with the Sicilian Defense, and I went into the lines of a smith-morra gambit, which he declined with d3, which is a serviceable move. The black actually has the edge usually in these positions. A standard recapture with the bishop. This is still the best line, best play for black. Knight f3, and then e6, which surprised me a little bit here. Normally d6 is that more popular move, with the idea that after playing d6, then this bishop can threaten to come out to g4, and white might have to waste time playing h3 to try to prevent that plan on black's part. So he did not do that. Instead, he played e6, and I went ahead and rapidly castled with the idea of trying to prevent d5. I figured that was his idea with e6, was to support the d5 pawn push. And if he did that, say he went to d5, I could have exchanged on the d file and then checked with my rook. He has to block with some piece, possibly with the bishop on e6, in which case I would have knight g5. Anyhow, whatever he does, if he develops a piece to e7, I could play bishop to g5. I can get pressure along that open e file. So that makes castling for him uncomfortable. Now, what he did, bishop g5, though, is I guess a novelty. It wasn't in the opening database, and it's probably not too good, although it's not an outright blunder, but it does give me the initiative, because I can play along the lines of an Evans gambit without giving up a pawn, attack that bishop. It's more like a Gioco piano, a d3 Gioco piano. And to be honest, I think at this point I did that quickly without even thinking about it too much, planning to follow up with a4. But the problem with doing that, of course, is that if I'm not really threatening anything, because if I then play a5 immediately after that, his bishop is not trapped. He has a very nice square to go back to on c7. So it loses a bit of its venom. So instead I developed my knight to d2, and wanting to get it quickly into the game, and possibly to threaten his bishop by going to c4. And at this point he played his queen to f6. And now that doesn't work out too well. The queen is rather exposed there. And I think, talking to Geoff after the game, he wanted to get take advantage of the fact that my knight here on d2 is temporarily blocking, some of my control over the queen side, or king side rather. And in particular, I couldn't play bishop g5 as a response. And he thought he had a window of opportunity here to come after my c-pawn. But I looked at it for a while and found what I think is a fairly good answer to that, which is to play knight c4. And he can't really afford to go in and take that pawn now, because if he does, then my bishop can just go to b2, attacking his queen. He only has one square to go to, which is to take the pawn. And then I take on g7, and now his rook is gone. So that would not have been a happy continuation for him. Of course, he saw that, and instead played bishop to c7. That was, I should point out, that was the other idea. With knight c4, I'm preventing him playing queen takes pawn, and I'm also attacking the bishop, gaining time. Then after he moves the bishop, then I have this e5 pawn push. And I had looked at it a move before and it didn't quite work, but it does now. And this is actually kind of an interesting sequence. I probably should have demonstrated it. So a move before, okay, right after he played queen f6, if I played e5, it doesn't quite, the idea is it doesn't quite work, where if he takes the pawn, I can't, my bishop doesn't have access to g5, so there's nothing to be done. But now, after he's retreated his bishop, seemingly putting another defender on this e5 square, I can actually play e5 because he can't take this pawn. If he does, he's in for hurt because of my bishop. So if he takes, say, with the knight, it doesn't, either way it fails. I take with my c knight, which is important, and when he takes back, I can then play bishop g5, and the queen's got nowhere to go. All its squares are taken away, and only by sacrificing a piece can he make an alleyway for his queen to get out of dodge. And so it costs him a whole piece doing that. So he can't take that e-pawn, is the long and short of it. He has to retreat the queen, and he could go to d8. Probably would have been better to go to d8. Instead he went to e7. And the problem is that it's still exposed even there, because I have this little maneuver where I attack his knight. I expected it to go back to b8. He didn't do that. He played a little more actively going to a5, but it doesn't matter, because I follow up with bishop at a3, and now that knight is protected by the knight that I moved 2 moves ago, and it's attacking the queen. So the queen has nowhere to go in this case except for d8, pushing the pawn to block. Just loses a piece after pawn takes pawn, and the bishop and queen are forked. So he can't do that. So all I can do after I play bishop a3 is to retreat the queen to d8. So I've gained yet another tempo, and I'm controlling these dark squares, keep making it very difficult for his king to castle, and also just threatening to invade on these dark squares. So it's a fairly dire position for black already. So what he did, or actually, sorry, it's white's move. He just moved his queen back to d8. So I came in and checked on d6. He traded off that knight, didn't want to leave it there. It was too strong. I think that's correct. But I take back with the bishop, and now he still has trouble on the dark squares. I thought he might play knight e7. Instead, he played b6, wanting to develop that light squared, well, one of two ideas. Either develop the light squared bishop to b7 to control this long diagonal, or potentially to develop the knight back to b7 to challenge my bishop. Neither one works terribly well. But I dropped my knight back in a move that I kind of was happy with, as I say in my notes here, because it did a couple of things. One thing it did was it allowed my queen access now to the king side. I can come out to g4 or h5 along that diagonal. The other thing is that I have the threat of redeploying my knight to e4 to now to either then to f6 in some cases or to d6. And in particular, if his knight attacked my bishop, I could go to e4, saying, go ahead, take my bishop, I'll take back with the knight, and I'll be happy to have a knight stuck on d6, you won't get it loose. So after that move, he developed his knight to e7 to block the line of my bishop that way and to possibly threaten castling. But I immediately came out and attacked on the king side with queen g4. And I would have been happy to see him castle at this point. There's just too much firepower on that side. What he played actually was g6. I don't know that that was a particularly good move, but none of the moves looked great. Stockfish wanted a line starting with bishop to b7, and after knight in order to trade the knight off, to keep my knight from coming into this into the game. And then after knight takes bishop and bishop takes back, it was willing to sacrifice the rook in the corner. And it was a question of keeping the evaluation at +4 and keeping it from climbing up into the +6 territory, which is where it's at right now because of these weak dark squares. And it's just kind of Swiss cheese, and especially with a knight that's threatening to hop into f6, it's a very tough position. What he was banking on was controlling that square with his knight on d5, but there's a couple problems with that. One is it's not stable there, so I can at any point here just play c4 and drive that knight away. The other problem is that he can't castle because he's opened up that diagonal again. So it doesn't really work that well. What I played was yet another move, which I thought was okay, threatening to bring my knight in through d6. Since he plugged up the f6 hole, I decided to threaten to come into d6. Now he might have played knight b5 here, or knight b7, in order to control that d6 square. I think that would have been maybe stronger than the text. You can take a look at that briefly. If you'd done that, I can drop my queen back, threatening to infiltrate through in the dark squares. After d6, c4 driving his knight away. I'm going to come in and check anyhow. So it's not a happy situation, whatever he does. But with knight e7, just going back to where he was, that allows me to come into d6 with check anyhow. And the king has to move. And then I have a strong move. I actually had two strong moves here. One possibility was to play queen to f3, and that's threatening checkmate on f7. And after he does something to defend the checkmate, I could have taken the rook on a8. I wasn't interested in that because I didn't want to sideline my queen. So instead, what I played was my queen to f4, with the idea that now I'm also threatening to come in through h6 with a check over there. And whatever he does, it just doesn't work well. Basically, knight to f5, there's knight takes knight, discovered check, which is bad. Or if I'd rather, actually, if knight to f5, I could come with my knight to b7, check, and win his queen, either with my knight or my bishop. And if he pushes, he has to do something about this mate. The only other thing I can see that would guard against the mate is to push the pawn. But then I play f6, and now I'm threatening not only to take the knight with check, but also to come into with the queen on h6 check. Anyhow, in this position, after I played f4, Geoff resigned. So, as I warned you, it was a fun game for me, not so much for him. But it was one of those games that happens, and I'm not sure why. I don't understand chess well enough, but where all the right moves just happened to be there. So I made a few positional good moves, and Geoff made a few positional mistakes, but that's happened in other games, and things don't click into place. Whereas this is one of those that just had a groove that the game wanted to follow, and so it almost played itself. And it was a happy evening and a short one. So thanks for listening. See you next week. Bye-bye.